Hello, so here's a quick video which shows how we can use DM script, which is Release Engineer's built-in scripting language, in combination with Release Engineer's RESTful API. And in this example, we're going to pull a set of users from an LDAP server and add them automatically to Release Engineer. So here in our home domain, we have a few users already set up. Including FIS tester who's sitting in our test subdomain. And what we need to do is to go off to our LDAP server and pull the users out of LDAP and add them automatically to Release Engineer to grow this list, essentially. So the way we're going to do that is to create a piece of DM script, and this is it. So very small, very short, but I'll just talk you through what we're doing here and how this will work. So the first thing is the actual query command itself. The query command takes a data source. It's normally used to query relational databases. So as part of your data source can be either ODBC or it can be LDAP. But in either way, you query your external data source and that returns a set of results representing the results of that query. In this particular instance, we're going to query an LDAP server. So our data source is actually just an LDAP server. Because of that, the remaining parameters will differ because we're querying LDAP rather than a relational database. So we're going to query our LDAP server, and what we're going to ask it for is these attributes. So I've set these attributes here. So LDAP attributes is basically just an array, and we're asking for the common name, the UID, and the email address from each found record. So we pass the attributes in, and those are the only attributes that this query is going to return. Think of that as like, a column list on a select statement if you're using ODBC, but because we haven't got SQL, we have to specify the attributes as an array. So we're basically passing common name, UID, and mail in as the attributes, and those are the attributes that are going to get returned. Then we have our filter parameter, which is a standard LDAP filter string. In this case, we're looking for records that are in the object class of person, so we're not going to get groups or organizations or any of that sort of stuff. We're just going to get people. We specify our search space, which is dcexample.dc.com. And then for every returned record, we place it into our row. Now, DM script obviously has the concept of arrays, and those arrays can be either lists, like you see here, or it can be an associative array. And an associative array just means that the subscripts of that array needn't be numeric. It could be a string, text string. And that's how Release Engineer works. So it's got this concept of associative arrays. So every row that comes back from this LDAP server is going to be pushed into our row. And we say row rather than a table because you'll notice there's a brace there. So the stuff within the brace, the code within the brace, will execute once for every row retrieved. So this query may retrieve one row, it may retrieve 1,000 rows. But what's going to happen is that for every row retrieved, it will execute this block between these two braces. Okay. So essentially, the first time through the loop, the row array will be set to the values of the first selected record. The second time it will be set to the values of the second selected record, and so on. So all of this block here is going to execute once for every user retrieved. So then what we do is we set another array called attributes, and these are the attributes that we're going to create our new user with. So this is an associative array, so we say set attributes, and it's a little like JSON. The syntax is quite similar insofar as we wrap it with braces and we say real name, email, and LDAP, and the real name is set to the value from our row. So There's a couple of syntaxes you can use to select these, but it also supports, Release Engineer supports the dot syntax as well. So we can say row.cn, and that's the common name back in this row. Similarly, we can say email is row.mail. So in this case, we've pulled the mail back, and that's gone into mail there. And we set our LDAP authentication server, because these users are coming from LDAP. So we need to set the login authenticator back to our LDAP server. So we point it back to web LDAP. So that's our list of attributes. So we're going to pull in the real name and the email. And then we're going to use Release Engineer's own API to actually create the user. So Release Engineer, DM script has a command called RESTful post, which essentially is a built-in command to post to over HTTP to a particular URL. So the result of that will generally be either JSON or XML, typically if it's a RESTful API, and we set the result of that goes into this result structure, which we can then query. So we're going to just post this URL to this server on this port. So that's basically going to our Release Engineer server. And the URL is DMAdmin API, new user, and then the row, the UID that comes up from the row, which was the last thing that we retrieved, that is the name of the user. So API new user, and then the username will create us a new user. And then we have optional attributes, which is essentially forms part of the URL. And so we're going to set real name, email, and the LDAP authentication with our attributes there. And that's it. The last cunning part is the cookie jar. The cookie jar is essentially a list of cookies that will get passed as part of this query. And what we're going to do is we're going to pass that our session ID. Now, the reason this works is the API would normally require you to authenticate. Okay, so typical API, you would have to either have a separate authentication call, which would then pass us back a session ID, or we include username and password as part of the API call, and that will just log us in for that one call and won't return a session ID. But either way, we would normally have to authenticate and log in. We don't want to do that from inside here because we're already logged in to Release Engineer and we're going to execute this piece of the script. So we don't want to specify another login. So fortunately, when we do this, our session ID is passed as a global variable in DM script. So all we have to do is to set up our cookie jar. Our key is session ID and the value is $session ID, and that will set the session ID to the same session that we have while we're logged in and using Release Engineer. So we pass that in as cookie jar, and so this API will get called as us. We don't have to log in again because it's going to reuse our session. So we're going to, for every row that comes back from LDAP, we're going to call our API. We're going to pass the values that we've selected from the LDAP server. And then we do a last minute check. We just say, because our API returns a success or failure indication, if it goes back with success, we say user created. Otherwise, we say failed to create user, and we pass, we pick out the error from the result JSON. So very simple piece of DM script. The way we have to execute that is we can't execute LDAP query, which is a DM script procedure. We can't execute that directly. So what we've done is we've created an action, dragged LDAP query on, called it LDAP query action, and connected it to a task which we can run. So if I come here and can click and do run action 124, which is essentially going to call our action, which then calls our procedure. So we just execute that. That's going to go off to our LDAP server, and there's the result. So you can see it's created user Newton, user Einstein, user Tesla, user Galileo. The only problem we had a failure. Path contains run number of elements. That's because there's a blank user name, so it comes back with a UID that's not set. Of course, we don't check for that, so we basically call our API, and our API says, well, you need to specify a user. So that's an error coming back from the API, which is failed to create user. But everything else has been created successfully. If we go to our users and groups, you can see all the users are there. And if I look at Newton, we've got our email address and our validation data source. So Newton can now log in and be validated against that LDAP server. And just to prove that that's all worked properly, if we try doing it again and running the action again, this time the API rejects the creation of user Newton, for example, because it already exists. So once you've set that DM script up, you can execute it as many times as you want, and if the user's new, it'll just create a new user. So hope you found that interesting. That's an example of that. I'm sure there'll be a few more videos to come to show the power of DM script and working with the API. But for now, bye-bye.